What is up, YouTube, and welcome to episode 51 of the Chaos Daily. Let's get straight into it. So, what happens when things go wrong? That's the topic of today's episode. Let's get into it. The print that I started yesterday, which had the version 3 V-tail, the diagonal stabilizer, and the ruddervator, as well as the new nose piece and the new fuselage end, that print failed. Diagnosing why something failed is a very important skill. It's something that every good engineer needs to learn, probably more than some of the other engineering things you have to learn. Learning how to discover what went wrong with something is the fastest way to make progress in a project, because if you don't know how it went wrong, how can you fix it? Trying to come up with a new way of doing something just because you couldn't figure out what was wrong doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because the new thing could still be susceptible to the old problem. So diagnosing problems is a key thing to learn. Now with resin printing, it's not a very big book. There's not a very big book of troubleshooting for resin printing. It's very simple. Unlike FDM printing, there are so many things that could be wrong. The first item in both FDM and resin printing is the first thing to check. Now, with tech support, there's the old cliche, have you tried turning it off and on again? Or have you checked that it's plugged in? These are usually your go-to things. But with resin printing or FDM printing, if it's not plugged in, or if you didn't turn it on and off again, it just doesn't work from the get-go. So yeah, if your print isn't working, it's not one of those two. So with resin printing and FDM printing, the cliche is, have you leveled your bed? Now, I know I've leveled my bed. My bed's been working perfectly so far, and it's still working perfectly. I've got another print going. So I know it's not the bed, because I'm getting good bed adhesion. And looking at these prints, you can see they were printing fine right up until a certain point. Now, there are a number of things that probably went wrong here. My suspicion is it's a couple of factors. The first factor is when I got my printer, I tuned my print settings based on how tight the FEP sheet is. So over time, your FEP sheet gets a little less taut. It becomes a little bit more slack. So when you lift each layer for the print, you have to lift just a little bit higher to make sure that you've cleared the FEP sheet, because when you lift, the FEP sheet will bow up, and at some point it releases, and then the resin flows back under. But as it gets older, that bow gets bigger and bigger, and you have to lift a little bit higher every time. So my settings were a bit low. I was tuned them low so that I can get better print times, because the FEP sheet was still nice and tight, and it was snapping very early. But it's a few prints in now, and I feel like it's not as tight anymore. After this failure, I cleaned down the machine, pulled out the resin, filtered it, cleaned the vat, did a full reset. Whenever there's a failure, it's good practice to do a full reset. So I did a full reset, and I noticed the FEP sheet didn't sound the same anymore. When you blow on the FEP sheet, it usually makes a vibration noise, or you could flick it, but I don't recommend that because it leaves dents in the FEP sheet, very small ones. But you can hear the sound, and it's like a drum. Now, when you first get it, it'll be a very high-pitched sound. And over time, that pitch lowers because it's getting more loose. So mine was definitely looser. I could definitely hear the change in pitch. And so that was my first clue. FEP sheet is not detaching fast enough. So I need to increase my lift height. The second thing I noticed is the point in which it started to fail. Now, with resin printing, it can start failing at a much earlier point before it actually causes the failure that you notice. So having a good inspection of the parts that fail to see if there are any earlier defects or changes that may have caused a knock-on effect further down. For instance, if something didn't print and stayed attached to the FEP sheet and then floated away and then got stuck on something else and caused issues elsewhere, an earlier defect, then that's probably your culprit. In my case, the failure mode seemed to happen over a wide band and all around the same height. And that tells me one thing. Something was happening globally in the vat. And what did I do at about that time when it was at that height? Well, I added more resin. And remember what I was saying about you got to be careful doing this because you could shock the temperature of the resin and it causes defects in the prints? Well, just look at these. Yeah. All of these have a defect line all around the same time that I added that resin. Now, I added it over the build plate to try and equalize the temperature as much as possible. Obviously, I poured it in too quickly, and it was too much of a change, and it shocked the ecosystem, basically. It changed the temperature of the vat the resin wasn't curing quite the same, something happened, and the old resin and the new resin didn't mix nicely. Things like these happen. So you have to be careful when topping off your resin. And that's what I tried to say in the previous episode, and look what happened to me. I wasn't careful enough. That's another thing to remember. Another problem with resin printing is patience. You have to be patient. You have to be patient. You can't rush things. You can't. I was getting too excited, right? This is where This is where the print really failed. I set my print settings too aggressive. This particular print I tuned even more because it was going to be a very long print. There was a lot on the print bed. I was excited to get it done. There was the new diagonal stabilizer and stuff. There was some trinkets for my mum. She wanted a baby Groot with a flower pot head and stuff like that. I was being a little too aggressive. I was being greedy. I wasn't being patient enough. So that was the real cause of the problem, was in the print setting. I've changed those settings. It's printing now. I don't have as much on the bed. Again, every time I learn more about printing, I want to squeeze more on the bed to make the most of every print. But when you do that, it has an adverse effect on your FEP sheet, and you lose a little bit of that tautness. Every time you lose that tautness, you have to make your lift heights a bit higher and all that sort of thing. So yeah, learning how to diagnose these failures is important. And the same with anything. The same with my Albatross. When I printed the version 1, I was able to look at the model and go, right, here are the points of failure. Here are the things that can be improved, and made those changes in one go. Now we're on the version 2. Version 2's worked fine. The only other place that I failed on was the vertical stabilizer, but that was a branch off from methodologies where I went with an internal structure of a certain type and switched to a different type. And when I switched to the different type, I had to relearn what the tolerances or what the limits of the material were. And that's what I discovered, is that the ribs were too far apart. And so I increased the rib count. And now you can see here, the rib count has improved. Like, the skin is much more taut. There's less collapsing. Aside from the defects from the total print failure, there was no issues. Looking at the nose cone, it is difficult to say whether the defects that I was seeing in the previous version, which most of them are gone, are still present in the new one, because there are defects that are probably from the total print failure, from the whole build, rather than that just particular area being a trouble spot. It's difficult to say, because it did kind of cause failures in that same place, but it also did on the back of the model on the underside, which tells me that's more of a universal fault across the whole layers, rather than a particular spot being too thin or having a slicing error. So I think I've solved that problem, and I couldn't tell from the tail section whether my changes have been a success or not, because, well, it failed long before it got to that point where those changes were implemented. But all the other changes, like the lightning holes and weight reduction methods that I've used on that part, seem to be working fine. It feels great. That part had very little defects on it. That was happily sitting in a part of the bed where none of the defects were happening, apparently. So you can see, by looking at where they were on the bed, which ones caused more errors than others, what part of the bed was failing, and then you can diagnose from there why that was failing. In my case, I overloaded the bed. Too much stuff on the bed, FEP sheet couldn't handle it, the lift height wasn't higher, lift speed was too much, and the cure times were too low. Everything was a little too gummy when I pulled it off, a little too soft. Hopefully that's helpful, and you've learned something like I have about why stuff fails. And yeah, so another print's going now. I don't have it as overloaded. I will have to print my mum's trinkets another time. So make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you're subscribed. If you're not, go check out my Patreon if you can. It really does help. And as always, I've been Chaos. And until next time, expect the unexpected. And I will see you guys later.
And a special thank you to all my patrons that help support the channel. If you would also like to support the channel, there's a link in the description.